Megan Newton, an 18-year-old girl from Stoke-on-Trent in Staffordshire, England, was a real star in her community. Despite her young age, she managed to achieve more than many people do in a lifetime. Megan was not only a bright and diligent student, but also a gifted athlete who devoted herself to football from an early age. The girl played for the Stoke Town Ladies women's team, and her coaches described her as a real ball of energy and a force to be reckoned with. But Megan spent most of her time coaching girls under 7 at the Norton Wanderers football school. She sincerely loved working with children and was going to take a coaching course from the Football Association to continue to develop in her favorite field. In addition, Megan set herself high academic goals. She aspired to enter a university in the United States on an athletic scholarship and become the first in her family to receive a university degree. She planned to study sports therapy to help athletes as a physiotherapist in the future. Everyone around her believed that Megan had a brilliant future ahead of her, and that she would definitely achieve her dreams thanks to her perseverance and good heart. Outside of school and training, Newton worked part-time at a local fish and chip shop in Trent Vale. Recently, the 18-year-old started living on her own in her own apartment on Fletcher Road. Her parents were proud of how independent and responsible their daughter had become. It seemed that Megan had a whole life ahead of her, full of accomplishments and joys. But fate decreed otherwise. Megan Newton was not just a talented athlete and a diligent student. Her most remarkable trait was her kindness and compassion for others. Since childhood, Megan has always been ready to lend a helping hand to those in need. One day, a girl from China whose family had just moved to England was transferred to her class at primary school. It was very difficult for the new girl to adapt, as she did not speak English at all. The teacher asked Megan to help her classmates settle in, and the girl gladly agreed. She patiently explained the material to the newcomer and helped her learn English. When the girl from China returned home after a while, she was already speaking the new language quite well, and all thanks to Megan's support. Newton's friendliness and openness did not disappear in her teenage years. Megan continued to be happy to help people. Her kindness was especially evident at the soccer school where Megan coached girls. Instead of resting on weekends, she devoted her time to working with young athletes. Everyone around her noted that Megan had a real passion for coaching. But Megan's golden heart was most appreciated by her family. For her mother, Sarah, the girl was not just a daughter, but her best friend. There were no secrets between them. They trusted each other and often consulted on important issues. Sarah always looked up to the wisdom of her daughter, who seemed much older than her years. So it's safe to say that Megan Newton was the golden heart of her community, a precious treasure for her family and friends, and just a wonderful person who could change this world for the better. But a cruel fate ended her life too soon. Friday, April 19th, 2019, seemed to be no different for Megan than any other day. As usual, she worked a shift at a fish and chips restaurant, which ended around 10:20 p.m. Then the 18-year-old headed to her apartment to change clothes, put on makeup, and do her hair before meeting her friends. Megan headed to a nightclub in Hanley, where she had fun with the company, dancing and enjoying a few drinks. The girl was in a great mood and had a smile on her face the whole evening. Around 3 a.m., just before the club closed, Megan, along with her friend and a young man, got into a taxi to go home. At approximately 3:44 a.m., surveillance cameras captured Megan entering the lobby of her building with the same young man she had shared a taxi with about an hour earlier. Together, they headed to the girl's apartment. Megan looked joyful and carefree. She was not afraid of her companion at all. The girl unlocked the door with her keys, and they both went inside. The detectives found the young man's behavior suspicious when they watched the recording. While Megan was unlocking the door, he stood behind her and looked around, as if checking for witnesses. At one point, he even looked directly into the camera lens. This behavior could have been attributed to caution or embarrassment at returning home with the girl. But in the light of further events, this footage took on a sinister meaning. Was he planning to harm Megan in advance, taking advantage of her gullibility? These questions haunt everyone who saw the video. Unfortunately, at 3:45 a.m., Megan's apartment door closed behind her and her overnight guest. The girl did not even realize that these were the last minutes of her life. On the morning of April 20th, 2019, shortly after dawn, one of Megan's neighbors made a shocking discovery. He found keys near the house that were marked with what looked like blood. The man handed the discovery over to an employee of the apartment complex. The latter, noticing the traces of blood, decided to check if everything was okay in the apartment to which the keys belonged. Entering the apartment with a neighbor, they saw a gruesome scene. Megan's naked, bloody body was lying on the bed. The girl was dead. A kitchen knife was lying next to her. Documents in the apartment confirmed the identity of the deceased. It was indeed Megan Newton. The neighbors immediately called the police. They will remember this terrible moment for the rest of their lives. Later, the body was taken to the morgue, where it was to be officially identified by Megan's parents. The family went through hours of incredible pain and despair. After all, they loved and were so proud of their daughter, who had just started her independent life, and now they will have to say goodbye to her forever. Unspeakable loss and grief that cannot be described in words. The police immediately surrounded the crime scene and called in experts to collect evidence. The autopsy revealed the horror of what Megan had to endure that night. First, she was strangled for 30 seconds, causing her to lose consciousness. Then she received 9 stab wounds to the back, which pierced both lungs. It was also obvious that Megan had been sexually assaulted. According to the medical examiner's report, the cause of death was stab wounds. The murder weapon, a knife from Megan's kitchen, was lying nearby. The bloody weapon, along with the keys, was sent to the laboratory. Investigators hoped that they would be able to find the perpetrator's DNA. They assumed that the killer had accidentally dropped the keys while fleeing the crime scene. Detectives began to reconstruct the chronology of events that night. After interviewing Megan's friends and relatives, they learned that the girl had been to a club and then taken a taxi home. Surveillance cameras captured Megan getting into a taxi with a friend and a young man who has not yet been identified. This made the boyfriend the prime suspect. It didn't take long for the police to find the main suspect. When the detectives carefully reviewed the surveillance footage from Megan's house, they recognized the young man who had entered the apartment with the girl. It was Joseph Trevor. Joseph, 18, came from a well-off and respected family. His father and mother were police officers. Despite the strict discipline at home, he had a perfectly normal childhood and adolescence. He lived in the neighborhood next door to Megan's. As it turned out, they knew each other from school and saw each other more than once in the companies of mutual friends. Joseph, like Megan, was a gifted soccer player. He played at a semi-professional level for Newcastle Town and even received a sports scholarship to study in the United States, where he was going to go after graduation. At the same time, Trevor was pursuing his college education, successfully studying and preparing for a career in sports. Those who knew him personally characterized Joseph as a kind, sociable, and popular young man. However, he also had another side to his personality, hidden from most people. Trevor could change his moods dramatically, become gloomy and aloof for no apparent reason. No one could predict whether he would be cheerful and friendly or harsh and unfriendly today. Investigating Megan's murder, the police found several disturbing facts in Joseph's biography. 3 years ago, when he was 15, he was accused of sexually harassing an underage girl. But since it was only an attempt and did not lead to intimate contact, no official charges were brought. However, rumors of the incident spread among Joseph's classmates. He was called a pervert, a rapist, and accused of pedophilia. Trevor had a hard time dealing with this harassment. He tried to forget and not think about those events. So when Megan was also sexually abused before her death, this information made investigators focus even more on Trevor's identity. Considering him as the main suspect, the police began to recreate Joseph's route on the night of the murder. They already knew from the camera footage that he was near a nightclub and got into a taxi with Megan. Later, they went to her apartment together, after which no one saw the girl alive. Before he met Megan in the taxi line, Joseph Trevor was also out with his friends that night. They, like Newton's company, decided to continue the party at one of Hanley's clubs. There, the classmates accidentally bumped into each other and greeted each other like old friends. However, each group continued to party separately. Unlike Megan, Joseph spent much less time in the club. The security guards noticed that he was carrying a bag with a white powder, probably a drug. They took him outside and called the police. Patrol officers detained the young man and took him to the police station, where it turned out that he was carrying ketamine. Trevor's parents were police officers and most likely already knew about their son's detention. Perhaps that is why Joseph was released on his own recognizance, with the drugs confiscated. The patrol officers let him go, ordering him to go home and not to use illegal substances anymore. But Trevor disobeyed the police and did not go home. Instead, he went back to the nightclub he had just been taken out of. But this time, he was not allowed inside. At about 2:40 a.m., Megan and her friend were leaving the club. While waiting for a taxi, she met Joseph, an old friend from school. He shared his night's adventures with Megan. He told her how he had been to the police station and that he did not want to go home in such a state to face the wrath of his police parents again. After all, they probably already knew about his arrest with drugs and were waiting for him at home for a serious conversation. Confused and upset, Joseph did not know what to do. Megan lent a helping hand to her classmate and allowed him to call his friend from her cell phone. Trevor couldn't find anyone who would be willing to take him in for the night. Then Megan offered to let him sleep on her couch and talk to his parents in the morning with a clear head. Joseph agreed. That is why the cameras recorded him getting into a taxi with Megan and her friend. On the way, he texted his father that he was supposed to spend the night at his friend's house. The taxi first dropped off Megan's companion at home and then headed to Newton's apartment on Fletcher Road. Around 4 a.m., cameras recorded their arrival. Investigators were convinced that a few hours after Megan and Joseph entered the apartment, he brutally attacked the girl, killing her. Surveillance footage left no doubt that Trevor was the last person to see Megan alive. The fact that he left the apartment alone and then threw away the keys to the apartment where Megan's bloody body was lying eloquently testified to his involvement in the crime. In addition, cameras recorded Joseph looking at his hand with bloodstains on the way home. So the police had no doubt that they had enough evidence to arrest Trevor for the murder. But the most surprising thing was that Joseph's parents had already heard about his crime from him. After he left Megan's apartment at dawn, he walked to one of the bridges over the A500 freeway. There, the young man sat on the edge of the bridge, dangling his legs over the roadway. Perhaps he was thinking about jumping off. Joseph probably realized that he would go to prison for what he had done. He didn't want to be held responsible for Megan's murder, and he might have taken a desperate step. Some people later recalled that Trevor had already had suicidal thoughts and had been seen on this bridge before. Fortunately, one of the drivers noticed a lone figure on the bridge and reported the potential suicide to the police. The patrol policeman arrived promptly and took Joseph to the hospital for a psychiatric examination. Later, he was discharged under the supervision of his father, who took his son home. There he told his mother the truth about what he had done. Joseph simply said that he had done something bad. The young man realized that he would be exposed anyway, and that it was better to confess. He made similar confessions to several of his friends, whom he called after returning home. It seemed that Trevor was driven by a desire to speak out, to somehow ease the burden of his actions. Joseph's mother, hearing the horrific truth from her son, immediately called the police and told them about his confession. At that time, detectives had already definitively identified Trevor as the main suspect thanks to surveillance cameras, and they were just preparing to arrest him. Shortly after Joseph's mother called the police, he was taken to the police station for questioning. There, the young man confessed that he had been in Megan's apartment that night. This was confirmed by a surveillance video of them entering the house together. According to Trevor, the girl allowed him to stay the night so that he would not be exposed to the wrath of his parents in a drunk and embarrassed state. Joseph stated that they then had consensual sexual intercourse. After that, he allegedly fell into a black hole and did not remember anything. The guy couldn't explain what happened after the intimacy with Megan. He claimed that at the time of the fall from reality, the girl was alive and well. Trevor did not try to downplay his role in the attack, but he also did not take responsibility for the murder. His testimony was intended to show the young man as a victim of capricious fate rather than a cold-blooded killer. Joseph's only memory of that night was Megan's apology. Trevor said that 3 years ago, after an incident with a minor, she was among the classmates who called him a pervert and a rapist. This deeply hurt the young man, but over time he tried to put those events out of his mind. According to Joseph's version, Megan's apology that night unexpectedly resurrected painful school memories. Allegedly, it was this conversation that triggered the rage attack. Trevor assumed that was when he grabbed the knife. However, he could not explain what happened next to the investigators. The police did not believe this story very much. It was too convenient for Joseph to lose his memory at the most important moment. The detectives were convinced that the young man was perfectly aware of his actions throughout the night. Most likely, Megan simply refused Trevor that night. She let him in out of kindness, allowed him to spend the night on the couch because she had known Joseph for many years and trusted him. They had gone to the same school, now the same college. Both loved soccer and dreamed of a career in sports. It is quite possible that when he returned to the apartment, Joseph tried to go further than just a friendly relationship. But Megan rejected his advances. Furious at the rejection and slowed down by alcohol and drugs, Trevor could have resorted to force. To prevent the girl from telling about the rape, he decided to silence her forever. Shortly after Megan Newton's death, Joseph Trevor was charged with the premeditated murder of a fellow student and 2 counts of sexual assault. Investigators found that Megan had been assaulted several times that night. Trevor was arrested at his home. Despite the evidence collected by the police, the young man refused to admit his guilt. At first, he claimed that he and Megan had consensual sexual intercourse that night. Joseph insisted on his innocence, forcing the girl's grieving family to prepare for a long and difficult trial. For almost 10 months, the prosecutor's office collected materials for the trial. Investigators had no doubt that they had gathered enough evidence to prove Trevor's guilt. However, on the first day of the trial, February 17, 2020, the unexpected happened. When the trial began, Joseph Trevor suddenly stood up and announced that he was pleading guilty to all charges. He probably realized that his line of defense was futile and wanted to avoid a long trial. After all, the jury would hardly have believed his story. Joseph was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to apply for early release no earlier than 21 years and 65 days. During the sentencing, Trevor turned to Megan's mother, Sarah, and silently said, "I'm sorry." This gesture infuriated the woman. The apology, which came too late and too cheaply, could not bring her daughter back or compensate for the pain the family had endured while waiting for the trial. Sarah perceived these pitiful apologies as an outrage to Megan's memory. After all, the girl was brutally taken from her life in her own home, and all hopes for a happy future were destroyed. Watching the video of Trevor calmly leaving the crime scene eloquently testified that he had no regrets for what he had done that night. And now, a few insincere phrases were supposed to atone for this monster? No, Sarah answered decisively. Nothing in the world could undo the damage done. Nothing could bring Megan back. The death of Megan Newton came as a terrible shock to everyone who knew this wonderful girl. She was an extremely kind and compassionate person, a true angel in her community. In her short life, Megan managed to give so much warmth and joy to others. The girl's best friend, Ricardo Eccles, said that he and Megan were planning a trip to Manchester the day after her death. The news of his girlfriend's death was a terrible blow for him, one he did not want to believe. For several days, the young man was in a state of shock. However, he found the strength to act. Ricardo organized a fundraiser to help the Newton family with Megan's funeral. He managed to raise several £1,000s, which he handed over to the girl's mother. After all, Megan always helped others in need, so now it was time to support those who loved her. During her life, Megan was an ardent fan of Stoke City Football Club. During one of the matches, fans and players held a minute of applause in her honor. The family raised funds to install a bench in Megan's memory in a picturesque park in Stoke-on-Trent. This bench overlooking a pond and a children's soccer field was to become a place of fond memory for the girl. Megan Newton's death is an irreparable loss for everyone who knew her. She was an incredibly talented and promising young woman who could have achieved everything she dreamed of. Unfortunately, she became a victim of a cruel and senseless crime just because she wanted to help a friend in a difficult situation. This tragedy makes us think about the unfairness of fate and how fragile human life is. Of course, there is no just punishment for Megan's killer. Nothing will bring her back to her family and friends, but perhaps this story will serve as a warning to others. Be careful, even when you want to help someone. And appreciate your loved ones, because no one knows how much time we have on this earth. But most importantly, let's remember Megan Newton as she was when she was alive, a cheerful, energetic, kind, and compassionate girl with a heart of gold. An angel who will always remain 18 years old. An angel who returned to heaven too soon. Wendy Marie Trapaga was born on April 29, 1981 in Miami, Florida, to Miriam and Ernest Trapaga. Despite the significant age difference, Miriam was 21 years younger than Ernest. Wendy's parents sincerely loved each other, and the girl grew up in an atmosphere of love and religiosity. Wendy was a real daddy's girl, adored him, and looked forward to her father's return from every trip. Ernest worked as a cargo plane pilot and was often on the road, but he always brought gifts to his beloved daughter. On March 31, 1988, a tragedy occurred that changed the lives of 6-year-old Wendy and her family forever. The airplane Ernest was piloting caught fire shortly after takeoff at an altitude of 150 feet and crashed into an empty area near the runway. All passengers and crew, including 61-year-old Ernest, died on the spot. This terrible loss came as a huge shock to little Wendy and affected the rest of her life. Miriam, who herself had experienced the sudden death of her beloved husband, made every effort to support her daughter during this difficult period and provide her with a secure future. She got a job as an assistant administrator at a school and gradually worked her way up the ranks until she became the head of the extracurricular programs department at a Miami-Dade County elementary school. Miriam later married Juan Benitez for the second time. Wendy became very close to her new half-siblings, who surrounded her with love and care. Wendy spent her teenage years calmly and happily with her loving family. The girl was fond of beauty and fashion, dreaming of a future job in the beauty industry. After graduating from high school, Wendy was even married for a while, but the marriage was short-lived. Inspired by the example of two relatives who had their own beauty salons, she entered the Label Cosmetology School in Miami in 2002. Michel Escoto, a tall, handsome, and very well-groomed young man, studied in the same group as Wendy. He was one of the few male students and immediately attracted Wendy's attention with his striking appearance and seductive demeanor. Michel was a real heartthrob, showering Wendy with compliments and quickly winning her affection. Despite the fact that he was almost 10 years older than her and belonged to a different social circle, they developed a close relationship that quickly turned romantic. However, Michel did not tell his new friend that he had been dating another woman, Yolanda Cirillo, a 28-year-old single mother, for more than 2 years. Michel even lived with Yolanda, who was unaware of his tendency to have affairs with other women behind her back. While Yolanda was waiting for him at home, Michel spent more and more time with Wendy, demonstrating his sincere affection for her and his desire to be close to her. Wendy and Michel's romance developed rapidly, and in less than 3 months, the couple announced their decision to get married. It came as a surprise to Wendy's family, especially her mother Miriam, who thought the move was hasty and rash. Miriam was concerned that the newlyweds had no stable income and even lived in a half-empty apartment, sleeping on the floor. Nevertheless, Wendy insisted on her decision, explaining to her mother that she was pregnant and wanted to have a child in a legal marriage. Despite the doubts of her family, Michel and Wendy were married on October 10, 2002, at Miami Beach City Hall. The ceremony was modest, without a lavish celebration. After the wedding, the couple went on a short honeymoon to the picturesque town of Key West, Florida, located in the southern part of the state. However, already during this trip, the first cracks in the couple's relationship appeared. Michel and Wendy quarreled over her drinking despite her pregnancy, which, as it turned out later, was fictitious. A honeymoon and a murder. Upon returning to Miami on Sunday evening, the newlyweds decided to continue their wedding celebration. Michel booked a room in a luxury hotel known for its romantic atmosphere. Wendy called her mother to inform her about the change of plans and to share her joy at the unexpected surprise arranged by her husband. They had planned a dinner at a restaurant, maybe a movie, and dancing at a nightclub. Despite some concerns for her pregnant daughter's health, Miriam was happy to see her happiness. Around midnight, Michel and Wendy arrived at the hotel. They spent several hours in the room enjoying each other's company. Wendy was happy and had no idea that this night would be her last. At about 4 a.m. on October 14, 2002, just 4 days after the wedding, Michel and Wendy left the hotel. On the way, a heated argument broke out between them. According to Michel's later testimony, Wendy confessed to him that she was not actually pregnant. An angry Michel got out of the car outside their home in South Beach, leaving Wendy alone in the car. That was the last time he saw his fiancée alive. On the morning of October 14th, 2002, at approximately 5:30 a.m., Miriam was awakened by the ringing of her phone. Even before she picked up the phone, she was seized by a terrible premonition of trouble. On the other end of the line was Michel Escoto, who asked in confusion if Miriam knew where Wendy was. The man said that last night they had had a fight in the car over Wendy's drinking, after which she dropped him off at his house and drove away. Michel allegedly tried to call his wife, but to no avail. Having agreed to inform each other in case of any news, the father-in-law and daughter-in-law ended the conversation. Miriam could not find a place to sit because she was worried about her daughter. Meanwhile, at about 6 a.m., a sanitation worker driving around Miami's northwestern industrial zone noticed the body of a young woman in a parking lot between two cars. The deceased was Wendy Trapaga. Her identity was quickly established thanks to her driver's license and other documents in a purse lying nearby. The horrific picture that the forensic experts saw shocked even seasoned experts. Wendy's face was mutilated almost beyond recognition, her entire body covered with numerous blunt force traumas. However, the weapon of the crime was not found at the scene. When Miriam learned the terrible news, she was completely heartbroken. At that moment, she received a call from Michel, who asked if there was any news about Wendy. Sobbing, the woman did not know how to tell her husband that his young wife was dead. One of the police officers joined the conversation and said that detectives would soon visit Michel to discuss the situation in detail. Stunned by the news of Wendy's death, Michel was unable to say a word. After giving him a few minutes to recover from the shock, the investigators invited Escoto to come with them to the police station and give a statement. During a 14-hour interrogation, Michel Escoto told detectives his version of the events leading up to Wendy's murder. According to him, around 3 a.m., the couple was returning home from the hotel when a heated argument broke out between them over Wendy's drinking. The girl admitted that she was not really pregnant, which made Michel even angrier. Once at their house, the man got out of the car, leaving Wendy alone to cool off. That was the last time he saw his wife alive. An autopsy of Wendy's body showed that she had been struck 15 to 20 times with a blunt object to the face and neck. It is possible that the murder weapon was a wrench. The injuries caused her head to become almost unrecognizable. Traces of strangulation were found on the victim's neck. It seems that the killer tried to cut off her air supply. There were traces of someone else's DNA under Wendy's nails, and alcohol and sleeping pills in her blood. According to the experts, the death occurred between 3 and 5 a.m., between the time the couple returned from the hotel and the discovery of the body. The pathologists also confirmed that Wendy was not pregnant. Studying the details of Michel Escoto's life, investigators found out that a few months before his wife's death, he had taken out an insurance policy for her worth $1 million. In the event of Wendy's death, the only beneficiary of the insurance was her husband, which led detectives to believe that there was a possible financial motive for the murder. But despite all the suspicions, there was no direct evidence against Michel. No murder weapon, fingerprints, or other traces linking him to Wendy's death were found at the crime scene. The mother and stepfather of the deceased, Miriam and Juan Benitez, made every effort to ensure that Michel did not receive insurance. The civil trial in this case lasted 3 years, during which Escoto testified several times, getting confused by the details and raising more and more suspicion with his behavior. Despite this, it was not possible to prove his involvement in Wendy's murder for a long time. A breakthrough in the investigation came from the analysis of Michel Escoto's phone calls. One of them, made at 3:15 a.m. on the day of Wendy's murder, led detectives to the suspect's ex-girlfriend, Yolanda Cirillo. During interrogation, the woman confessed that Michel had cheated on her with Wendy and then suddenly left her. Once Cirillo met with Escoto, and he admitted that he had fictitiously married Wendy, ostensibly because she was pregnant, but in fact because of insurance. Yolanda also said that she last saw Michel in the early morning hours of October 14, 2002, when he arrived at her house covered in blood and holding a screwdriver. Together, they hid his bloody clothes and got rid of the murder weapon. Yolanda Cirillo's testimony became a key piece of evidence in the case against Michel Escoto. After many years of investigation and court hearings, the suspect was finally found guilty of premeditated murder in the first degree in April 2014. During the hearings, Cirillo described in detail the preparation and implementation of the horrific plan. How Michel drugged Wendy in the hotel room, how he drove her to a deserted place on the outskirts of Miami in the middle of the night, how he beat his wife over the head with a screwdriver, and then asked Yolanda to help him get rid of the body and evidence. Michel Escoto was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Yolanda Cirillo avoided punishment in exchange for her testimony, a circumstance that outraged Wendy's family. They were convinced that Yolanda had played a more active role in the murder than she had told the police and deserved to be punished as severely as Michel. Nevertheless, this criminal case has finally come to an end, and the perpetrators, at least the main suspect, have been punished for the brutal murder of 21-year-old Wendy Trapaga. The girl's grieving family was able to find solace, at least in part, in the knowledge that justice had been served.
In this dark world of tragic stories, often made even more horrific by fame and glitter, the event I am about to tell remains one of the most famous and horrific. This tale will reveal a story of beauty, success, and betrayal that was cut short in a ruthless maelstrom of greed and revenge. Dorothy Ruth Hoog Stratten was a young Canadian model whose life promised a bright future in the realm of fame. However, fate had a dark ending in store for her. Born on February 28, 1960, in the suburbs of Vancouver to modest immigrants from the Netherlands, Dorothy was the second child after her brother John and older sister Louise. In her younger years, Dorothy never dreamed of a brilliant career or a social life. All she wanted were simple pleasures that her modest family could not afford. As a high school student in 1977, she worked part-time as a waitress at the local Dairy Queen. Her blonde hair, charming beauty, and slender figure, unusual for her age, quickly attracted the attention of customers of all ages and incomes. One evening, shortly before closing time, a handsome young man named Paul Snyder came into the cafe. He noticed a young, attractive waitress and decided to propose to her. He would leave the rest of the bill as a tip if she agreed to go out with him. Dorothy agreed without hesitation. At the time, 26-year-old Paul Snyder was a well-known figure in Vancouver. He worked as a manager and scout for nightclubs. With numerous connections across Canada, Paul immediately saw the enormous potential in 17-year-old Dorothy. After their first romantic evening in a restaurant, he gave her a red evening dress to wear to the prom. A few months into the relationship, Paul began to persuade the blonde to go nude for a photo shoot. Despite her initial uncertainty, Dorothy agreed, hoping for favorable prospects in the modeling business. Snyder organized a professional photo shoot and then sent the photos to the editorial office of the iconic Playboy magazine. Dorothy's photographs made a splash, and she was invited to Los Angeles to participate in a prestigious magazine. Bypassing his parents' prohibition, Paul traveled to the United States with the girl using a forged permit. In the summer of 1979, Dorothy Stratten became the Playgirl of the Month for August, and soon began working as a waitress at the Playboy Club. Being in a new whirlwind of popularity, she felt excited by the interest of rich men who showered her with compliments. Paul Snyder was always there for her, acting as her manager, driver, and organizing her contracts. He gradually took control of her entire life. Soon, Snyder proposed marriage to her, and feeling grateful, Dorothy agreed, despite her family's warnings about the groom's selfish intentions. In 1979, Paul and Dorothy were married in Las Vegas in a modest ceremony. In the following years, Dorothy actively acted in films, demonstrating not only her beauty, but also her acting skills. Her growing popularity brought her considerable fees, with which they bought a house in Los Angeles. Paul was proud of his wife's achievements and controlled her finances and assets. He dictated the terms of her diet, style, social life, even who she should become intimate with to advance her career. Rumors circulated about Dorothy's affair with Hugh Hefner, but the latter denied the gossip, emphasizing the model's high moral principles. Over time, Dorothy realized her husband's excessive control over her life. She hired a new manager and began to avoid Paul on the set. Their relationship deteriorated, and the jealous Paul resorted to physical violence and hired a private detective to follow her. In the spring of 1980, at a party at the Hefner estate, Dorothy met the famous director Peter Bogdanovich, a friend of the owner. He offered her the role of his mistress in his new comedy, They All Laughed. Dorothy accepted the offer and traveled to New York for filming. misleading Paul about the ban on outsiders on the set. In fact, she was trying to avoid scenes with her jealous husband. During the filming in New York, a passionate romance broke out between the actress and the director. Dorothy felt happy with this new, rich and influential man. She spent 2 months away from jealous Paul, who stayed at home and cheated on her with other women. In April 1980, Dorothy returned to California for the Playmate of the Year award from Playboy magazine. She was awarded the prestigious title and a cash prize of $200,000. She also received a gift, Jaguar. After the ceremony, Dorothy toured Canada for 2 weeks, spending weekends with Bogdanovich. When he learned of Dorothy's plans to visit her parents in Vancouver at the end of the tour, Paul Snider immediately flew to Canada. Using his old connections in the club business, he forced his wife to work in nightclubs and embezzled all her fees. During this visit, a sharp quarrel broke out between the couple, and the upset Dorothy even offered to leave her career to save their marriage and return to her parents in Vancouver. However, she later changed her mind. After the Canadian tour, Dorothy returned to New York to film They All Laughed, ignoring her husband's calls. One day she called Paul herself and asked for more freedom in the relationship. Snider fell into a deep depression because of his wife's infidelity. It is known that at the time, he was dating an underage model girl, hoping to make her a new Playboy bunny. However, he soon realized that she would never outshine his wife's popularity. In June 1980, on their first anniversary, Paul received an extremely upsetting letter from Dorothy. In it, she announced her intention to divorce him and cut off his financial support. This confirmed Snider's worst fears about his wife's infidelity with Bogdanovich. In response, he hired a private investigator to gather evidence of her infidelity. One day, during a conversation with Dorothy's manager, Paul threatened to make a scandal or even do something much worse. The manager warned Dorothy to hire a bodyguard and to be careful with her jealous husband, but she ignored this advice. Without a green card as a non-US citizen, Paul faced difficulties in finding employment. His financial resources were dwindling, which led him to steal from their joint accounts and sell off valuables, including a Playboy-gifted Jaguar, for next to nothing. He focused on cash transactions and rented out rooms in their home. Gradually, Snider began to consider returning to Canada. In mid-July 1980, the filming of They All Laughed came to an end. So Dorothy and Bogdanovich went on a 10-day vacation to England, and upon their return on July 30th, the model moved into the director's estate in Bel Air. The next day, July 31st, Paul Snider borrowed a firearm from a friend. In the evening, he drove up to Bogdanovich's estate with the weapon and intended to shoot anyone who approached the gate. After several hours of waiting, Snider drove to a mountainous area overlooking Los Angeles at night. He later admitted that it was there that he was tormented by suicidal thoughts. Paul returned home that night. A week later, on August 8th, he managed to convince Dorothy to meet him at their home. He hoped to restore their relationship by using the same charm he had used to seduce her in the cafe. But Dorothy was no longer a naive girl. She was now a self-confident woman. She openly announced to her husband that she loved someone else and intended to divorce him. Snider remained calm and asked her to return in a week to discuss the details of the divorce. The next day, Paul desperately tried to get a firearm. He visited many shops, but the owners refused to sell him a rifle because of his Canadian citizenship. Even his private investigator refused to help him buy a rifle. On August 11th, Snider came across an ad for an antique 12-gauge hunting rifle for sale. He drove to San Fernando, but got lost and never found the seller. 2 days later, on August 13th, he managed to buy the old gun, explaining to the seller that he needed it for hunting. On August 14th, the day before his meeting with Dorothy, Paul insisted that his tenants leave the building for a while to ensure the privacy of his conversation with his wife. Dorothy's managers warned her not to go to the meeting alone, but she rejected the advice, taking with her a considerable amount of money as a token of gratitude for the years of cooperation with Paul. The model hoped for a peaceful divorce. Dorothy arrived home around noon. Shortly after her arrival, she received a phone call from her manager, a security check with a pre-arranged code word to be used in case of a threat. Dorothy assured the caller that everything was fine and quickly ended the conversation. The beginning of the conversation between her and Snider seemed quite calm. However, the situation soon spiraled out of control. In a fit of senseless rage, Paul grabbed a shotgun and killed his wife with a shot to the face. According to some reports, after committing this brutal murder, Paul Snyder committed an act of necrophilia with the body of his late wife before turning the gun on himself. At 8 p.m. that day, the tenants returned to the house and found Dorothy's car parked. In the living room, they saw her purse. Assuming that Paul had reconciled with his wife and that she was in the bedroom with him, they moved away so as not to disturb the couple. Meanwhile, Dorothy's managers were becoming increasingly concerned about her silence on the phone. At midnight, they were finally able to reach someone at the Snyder home. The tenants took the call and after a conversation finally decided to check the couple's bedroom. There, they were greeted by a horrifying sight. Both Dorothy and Paul were dead. A forensic examination revealed that 20-year-old Dorothy Stratten died about an hour after arriving home. Her 29-year-old husband, Paul Snyder, passed away about an hour later. Hugh Hefner was one of the first to learn about this tragedy. He personally told his friend Peter Bogdanovich the terrible news. Upon hearing about the death of his beloved, the director fainted from shock and was subsequently sedated for a long time. At the time of the incident, the August issue of Playboy had already been sent to press, so the editors did not have time to change its cover. As a result, it featured a photograph of the murdered Dorothy Stratten. However, in the Playboy calendar, her image was replaced with a photo of another model. Hugh Hefner expressed his opinion on this horrific story. There is a stereotype that a poor girl from a small town gets on the pages of a magazine, moves to Hollywood, builds a brilliant career, and tragically dies at the peak of her abilities. But this is not always the case. Paul Snyder was a sick egomaniac who realized that his lucky ticket was slipping away from him, and that's what drove him to commit this horrible act. Peter Bogdanovich took over the organization and financing of Dorothy Stratten's funeral. The loss of his beloved was a devastating blow to him. He decided to cremate her body and bury her ashes in a Los Angeles cemetery. After the model's death, the film company refused to release the movie They All Laughed. In order to ensure that the film would be released, Bogdanovich bought the rights to the film at his own expense. The comedy was finally released in 1981, but it did not win any significant awards or public recognition. This commercial failure consumed millions of dollars and eventually led Bogdanovich to bankruptcy. A few years later, rumors appeared in the press that the director had been molesting Dorothy's younger sister Louise, who was 13 at the time, before he married her. The Stratten family strongly rejected the rumors and even filed lawsuits against those who spread them. However, in 1988, 8 years after the model's death, 49-year-old Bogdanovich married 20-year-old Louise Stratten. Louise herself claimed that their relationship began when she was 18. The marriage of Peter Bogdanovich and Louise Stratten lasted 13 years and ended in divorce in 2001. The director never married again, devoting his life to cinema. He died in 2022 at the age of 82. Louise Stratten currently lives in her native Vancouver, working as an actress and producer. More than 4 decades after Dorothy Stratten's murder, her life and story continue to inspire artists to create works ranging from films and books to songs. A recent tribute to her memory is in the crime drama Welcome to the Chippendales, which tells the story of the founders of the popular male striptease troupe. In the series, the role of Dorothy is played by Nicola Peltz, the daughter-in-law of the Beckham family. So this is an updated version of the infamous story about a young beauty with rainbow dreams whose life was cut short by greed and jealousy. The story of Dorothy Stratten has forever entered the treasury of tragic cases caused by revenge and ambition. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Don't forget to like and share your opinion in the comments. On a sunny January evening in 2004, the town of Sarasota, Florida, was filled with peace and grace. 11-year-old Carly Brucia was saying goodbye to her best friend after a day of fun. The girls had a great time playing and having fun, as kids their age usually do. However, no one even suspected that this carefree day would turn into a terrible tragedy. Usually, Carly's mother or stepfather would pick her up when she was visiting a friend. That day, however, her parents were very busy, so the girl decided to walk home on her own. The distance was short, and the sun was still shining outside, so it seemed like nothing bad could happen. Carly promised to be careful and not to wander, because she had an important soccer match on TV that she was going to watch with her family. Innocent and cheerful, Carly left her friend's house around 6:15 p.m. and headed down a narrow street lined with 1- and 2-story houses. However, when her friend's mother called Brucia's home, it turned out that no one had allowed the girl to go alone. The worried woman immediately asked her husband to drive the car and go to intercept her daughter. Carly's stepfather searched the entire neighborhood, driving repeatedly along the route the girl was supposed to take, but to no avail. Carly was nowhere to be seen. The frightened family began to call their daughter's friends, thinking that she might have visited one of them, but in vain. No one had seen the girl since the moment she said goodbye to her friend. Soon, around 7:30 p.m., when waiting made no sense anymore, the parents reported their 11-year-old daughter missing to the police. Law enforcement officers immediately pulled together all available forces to search for the girl. They interviewed passers-by, looked into basements and parks, and searched every suspicious building and nook and cranny. However, no trace of little Carly could be found. The search lasted all night with intense but futile work. The girl disappeared, as if she had vanished into thin air. The only clue was the testimony of her stepfather about a red truck that circled the area where Carly was last seen. With the first rays of the new day, a new phase of the search began. Investigators decided to review CCTV footage in the vicinity of the girl's route. Undoubtedly, small details could help to put together a picture of that ill-fated evening. And then, on one of the recordings from a large car wash, the detectives saw something terrible. The video clearly captured the moment when, at 18:21, a few minutes after Carly left her friend's house, the girl was walking along a regular path past the car wash. Suddenly, an unknown middle-aged man in work clothes approached her. He said something sharply to Carla, then roughly grabbed her arm and led her away from the camera. Investigators were shocked by what they saw. It seemed that the video captured the very moment of little Carly Brucia's abduction. The attacker was clearly acting boldly and decisively, and his movements showed that he was threatening the girl, possibly with a weapon, to obey and not to lag behind. The whole thing looked terrifying and reminiscent of the worst horror movie. In desperation, law enforcement officers made every effort to identify the perpetrator on the recording. Watching these inhuman images was heartbreaking, but they had to act quickly before it was too late to save the child's life. The first clue for investigators was a red pickup truck seen by Carly Brucia's stepfather near the girl's disappearance. Initially, suspicion fell on the owner of the vehicle, the stepfather of Carly's friend Ron. However, when the investigators interviewed the man, he provided a convincing alibi. Ron said that after Carly's mother became concerned about the situation, he decided to join the search for the missing child. Colleagues and acquaintances corroborated Ron's testimony, and investigators were forced to reject him as a suspect. Instead, the detectives focused all their attention on the person in the video, an unidentified man in work clothes with a patch that looked like a name. His behavior and bold actions immediately gave him away as a person with a criminal past and inclinations. Soon, one of his friends suggested that it could be 37-year-old Joseph Smith, a car mechanic with a rather impressive criminal record. As it turned out, Smith had a number of arrests for various offenses, ranging from possession of illegal substances to assault, kidnapping, and false imprisonment. At the time of Carly's alleged abduction, the man was on parole after one of his previous sentences. However, even the status of a parolee did not stop Smith from committing new crimes. He had already violated his parole twice, but somehow avoided returning to prison. Now law enforcement suspected that the incorrigible criminal was in serious trouble again. When Joseph Smith was summoned for questioning, he denied any involvement in the disappearance of Carly Brucia. The man claimed that he was in a completely different place that evening and could not have been near the car wash. However, some details of the man's appearance in the video suspiciously resembled Smith himself. Similar build, height, even the way he walked. Although Joseph claimed his innocence, investigators decided not to let him out of their sight. After all, who else could the kidnapping record relate to, if not a repeat offender with a penchant for violent crime? Consequently, the investigation focused on Joseph Smith and his possible involvement. At first, the case against Smith seemed somewhat unconvincing. First, The color and model of the car the man was driving did not appear to match the vehicle of a suspect named Joseph. However, the investigation soon uncovered compelling evidence of the man's alleged involvement. After thoroughly reviewing surveillance footage from the entire neighborhood, detectives saw a light-colored Buick enter the car wash only 3 minutes before Carly's abduction. The owner of this particular Buick turned out to be an elderly couple with whom Joseph Smith had rented a room. During the search of Smith's apartment, they found a number of his gray car mechanic work suits with a Joe patch, very similar to the clothes of the attacker in the video. In addition, several hairs matching the structure of the hair of the missing Carly Brucia were found on the Buick evidence vehicle. Despite all these suspicious coincidences, as well as the spoons found with the remains of illegal substances, Joseph Smith continued to insist on his innocence in the girl's abduction. However, his assurances lost their credibility when it turned out that the man had seen reports about Carly's disappearance on the news and had blatantly lied to investigators about his presence at home on the decisive evening of the tragedy. All the details of the suspicion against Smith gradually added up to a terrifying puzzle. Few doubted whether the hardened criminal was ready to admit his guilt in court. The chances of acquittal were becoming more and more illusory. Backed into a corner by undeniable evidence, Joseph Smith realized that he needed some way out of the situation. And then he had the idea to confess to his family, hoping for their understanding and mercy. The first people to whom Smith revealed the terrible truth were his brother John and his mother. Under pressure from his relatives, whom he was trying to comfort, the man finally confessed to all the details of the horrific kidnapping and murder of Carly Brucia. In a voice broken and trembling with the details of his own story, Joseph said that he had taken the girl by force to his car, where he committed the heinous crime of raping her and then allegedly strangling her. The perpetrator also pointed out the place where he hid the victim's body after the massacre. John remained silent before the investigators for several days, still hoping that his brother would turn out to be innocent. However, when he realized that the police could implicate him in the case and recognize him as an accomplice by omission, he decided to tell law enforcement everything Joseph had revealed to him. John took the investigators to the place where the dismembered remains of the unfortunate Carly lay under the branches of a small church a few hundred meters away. Apparently, in an attempt to hide the traces of the crime, Joseph tried to dismember the victim's body. At the trial, the evidence of Smith's guilt proved to be overwhelming and impressive. The video from the camera that recorded the child's abduction, the coincidence of evidence and findings from the suspect's car and apartment, and Joseph's DNA on the victim's body all created a complete and gruesome picture of the crime and its perpetrator. Despite his fierce attempts to deny the charges, Smith was sentenced to death due to the particular cruelty of his murder of a young child. It seemed that he would not be able to get any discounts or excuses. However, there was another unexpected twist in Joseph Smith's fate. In 2017, more than a decade after his conviction, the death penalty was suddenly canceled. The reason was a change in the law. Now a unanimous jury verdict was required to impose the death penalty. In Smith's case, the jury was not so unanimous in the need for his execution. 10 out of 12 were in favor of execution. At the same time, no one was going to release a long-term repeat killer so easily. Despite the reversal of the death sentence, Joseph Smith was left to serve life without parole. He seemed to be behind bars forever because of his heinous crime. However, Florida authorities decided to reinstate Smith's death sentence. In April 2020, the court reconsidered the possibility of execution and still returned this capital punishment. The murder of a young child was too grave and brutal to let the killer live. In the end, the long-awaited death sentence was never carried out. On July 26, 2021, at the age of 55, Joseph Smith died in the prison hospital of natural causes. His terminal illness outstripped the punishment of justice. Despite the fact that the proceedings in the case of the kidnapping and murder of Carly Brucia have been officially closed, the troublemaker Joseph Smith continues to haunt investigators. According to some indications, he may be involved in another unsolved murder of a teenage girl that occurred in 2000. Frankly speaking, even John's own brother suggested that that horrible case could also have been the work of this incorrigible criminal. Unfortunately, however, it proved impossible to find conclusive evidence of Smith's involvement in another murder. Investigators worked hard, but did not find a single key clue that would allow them to officially link Joseph to that old case. Therefore, there is a high probability that the 2000 murder will remain an unsolved police mystery for many years. The tragic story of Carly Brucia struck the hearts of many people with its cruelty and senselessness. The little girl's life ended so suddenly and horribly because of one single incorrigible criminal. However, the victims should never be forgotten, nor should those who sacrificed their lives to unravel this painful case and punish the offender. May the memory of Carla forever remain a bright spot in the darkness of human cruelty.